right, live broadcast.
Yeah. Dear friends, thanks for joining the Bishkek American Spaces Facebook Live. Today, December 10, is International Human Rights Day, and we invited the Bishkek US Embassy representative, Colin Cram, for Human Rights Talk. Good evening, Colin.
Hi, how's everybody? Thanks for having me.
Thank
Go ahead. Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you for joining today's session. And dear friends, today for Human Rights Day, we will learn from our guest speaker what are human rights and its importance. And please ask your questions in the comment section, and our guest speaker will answer them during this live. Colin, I see people started joining us. If you are ready, the stage is yours.
Okay, great. I am ready. Just to introduce myself, my name is Colin Cram. I work at the U.S. Embassy. I am a political officer there, and specifically, I am the human rights officer, among other things. One of the things I do at the embassy is I work with all aspects of human rights in terms of our bilateral relationship with the Kyrgyz Republic. Today I have it's a fairly short presentation on Human Rights Day in general, and then how the U.S. works in human rights and some of the things we do here. Look forward to sharing it with you, and I'm glad you guys have come to this talk. I'm excited to engage. So if we could start with the first slide, that'd be great.
Yeah, we're excited too. Let me share the presentation. Can you see?
It's loading. There we go. Okay, well, as this says, Happy International Human Rights Day. Today is International Human Rights Day, and it's today. So December 10th is a very specific day that they chose for Human Rights Day, and if we could go to the next slide, please. So why did they choose today as Human Rights Day? Well, Human Rights Day celebrates the day that the United Nations General Assembly adopted in 1948 the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights was it still is an incredibly important document. It is really the basis for most international law on human rights. Much of the ideas on human rights come, especially modern ideas about human rights, come from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not the first document to cover human rights. There are many that came before it. For example, in England, there was the Magna Carta, which significantly reduced the power of the king and gave regular people more rights in the say of their government. Another good example, the U.S. Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights. I'm sure you guys are all aware, the U.S. Constitution has a section called the Bill of Rights that stipulates the rights that every American has. Many of those principles ended up informing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for those of you who are learning English, I actually have a tough time saying the word declaration, especially when I'm saying it in a sentence quickly. So just so you know, even if you are a native English speaker, sometimes the language trips you up. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims inalienable rights, and inalienable means that no one can take them away from a person. So these inalienable rights are that everyone is entitled as a human being to specific rights, regardless of their race, color, religion, sex, language, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And this year, the UN has chosen a specific theme for Human Rights Day, which is Recover Better, Standing Up for Human Rights. This is actually focused on COVID. I think the UN is very specifically looking at this because there's been a lot of concerns in human rights circles that COVID has resulted in a backslide for human rights and to some degree. And we've seen it around the world, and there's been a lot of debate on it. Even in the United States, we've had a fair amount of debate on this. There's concerns that there's a balance between the need for people to isolate and to not be in large crowds with their fundamental rights. And so there's been a lot of significant debate about that. In the United States this summer, we had a lot of debate surrounding the protests after the killing of George Floyd and the protests against police. And so this theme is really about ensuring that human rights carry through after the pandemic improves, and that the pandemic isn't used as an excuse to trample human rights. Certainly, in some countries, we've seen sort of a blanket ban on freedom of speech, things like that, under the guise of COVID restrictions. I think we as the United States government take a pretty broad view of the need for some degree of COVID restrictions, but we also recognize that when that starts to eat into fundamental human rights, that's problematic. Another example for the United States that just occurred is the Supreme Court decided that New York could not unilaterally cancel religious services due to the pandemic because that would violate Americans' religious rights. And so I think that's a good example of how there are these sort of balances between the need to isolate and to protect one another and the sort of human rights that underpin our societies. Could we go to the next slide, please? One of the, I work in the U.S. Embassy. I'm a diplomat, this question of why the United States engages in human rights and what specifically our aims are when we talk about human rights comes up quite a bit. First and foremost, we believe that human rights are universal, that all people are deserving of them, as it says in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And so one of our major foreign policy components is the need to speak loudly for human rights when it comes to our relationships with other countries. So this quote in the PowerPoint is actually it's discussing the underpinnings of our thoughts on human rights. And so this quote says, supporting democracy not only promotes such fundamental American values as religious freedom and workers' rights, but also helps create a more stable, or a more secure, stable, and prosperous global arena in which the United States can advance its national interests. In addition, democracy is one national interest that helps to secure all the others. Excuse me. Democratically governed nations are more likely to secure peace, deter aggression, expand open markets, promote economic development, protect citizens, combat international terrorism and crime, uphold human and worker rights, avoid humanitarian crises and refugee flows, and improve the global environment and protect human health. So at the core of our beliefs on human rights, we fundamentally believe that one of the major underpinnings of human rights are democratic systems. The systems in which people are able to make their decisions about their government. The government has to answer to the people, and in which the government takes its power from the people of that country. And we believe that democratic states tend to protect human rights better. They tend to encourage participation of all people, whether they're one ethnicity or another, whether they're one religion or another. And ultimately that there tends to be less violence in democratic states, that they're better suited to prevent violent extremism and things of that nature, because the people of those countries have fundamental human rights. And so I put this up because, and this is, this is no secret. This is on our website, on the Department of State's website. We let people know that this is our feeling. But I think it's a very important aspect when we discuss human rights with other countries, because at the core of our human rights is always the question: do people in this country have representation? Are they able to choose their own government and make decisions that the government will heed and respect? And that's sort of where the rest of our human rights spring from. Next slide, please. In the U.S. government opinion, I should say. There are others who would argue otherwise. So other priorities we have beyond just sort of democratic societies, we have quite a few. Religious freedom is a major one. It's one that the U.S. tends to prioritize more than other countries. I think our country was founded on some pretty clear principles of religious freedom, and it should be said, when we talk about religious freedom, that is also the freedom not to have a religion, in our opinion. That people don't have to worship a specific religion, that they do not need to participate in religion. And one of the core underpinnings of our own religious freedom in the United States is a separation between religious entities like churches and the actual government. We do not have an official religion. We do not allow religious decisions to bleed over into our foreign policy or any of our policy. And there's actually, in the U.S. Constitution, there's something called the Establishment Clause, which says that Congress shall not establish any religion for the United States. And we use that as sort of a way to think about religious freedom in general, in terms of our priorities, including prioritizing the ability of people to worship as they please or not worship at all. Labor rights. We believe that labor rights, especially the ability to be part of a union, to organize, to strike, to have freedom of association, is very important. We believe that's an incredibly important underpinning, not only for normal people who are working so that they have the protections they need, but also it's an important part of civil society that really drives many of our conversations surrounding individual freedoms and protection. Like I said, freedom of association was something I just mentioned with the labor unions, but also freedom of assembly, the freedom of people to protest without fear of reprisal, to protest without being, without the government being violent towards them. The freedom of people to petition the government and tell the government what they think about things they don't like. Freedom of speech. This is a major one, along with religious freedom. We believe that human beings have the right to criticize their governments, have the right to say unpopular things, that people have the right to say and express themselves in ways that, provided it's not calling for violence, things like that. We do believe there are some limits to freedom of speech, but that generally people have the right to say unpopular things without fear of arrest or detention. Minority rights is another major one. Ethnic minorities, but also religious minorities, ensuring that people who are of the minority have a voice within countries, that they aren't cut out of the political processes, that they're not arrested or persecuted simply because they are a member of a minority. All these things are very important to us. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so ultimately, I think one of the more interesting things, we're talking human rights. It's Human Rights Day. My work is essentially human rights. It's not the only thing I do, but it's something I do pretty frequently. And so, these questions of what do I as a diplomat do in the Kyrgyz Republic? Well, I think, as you can imagine, we actually have human rights officers in virtually every country we work in. It's not specific countries we choose them for. Obviously, in some countries, the human rights officer is much more complicated than others. I think an excellent example, China. I'm sure you've seen quite a bit of the news on Xinjiang and the situation with Uyghurs there. That's something the U.S. government spends a lot of time talking about. We're very concerned about the situation there. A human rights officer in Beijing would have a very complicated job and would have to deal with that sort of stuff a lot. So what do I do here in the Kyrgyz Republic? Well, I work and meet with human rights organizations, with civil society organizations, a wide range of organizations that focus on issues, and those issues range from, like I said, religious freedom, just sort of general human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. I do meet with labor organizations, I meet with religious organizations to talk about how they work with the government here and their engagement and how they feel about their ability to worship, and then certainly other sort of subtypes. One good example is NGOs that advocate for the rights of LGBTI people. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered people. Certainly organizations that work to prevent torture is another subset of organizations that I meet with. And all of this is done essentially to know as much as I can about the situation of human rights within the Kyrgyz Republic, and also to work with these folks to hopefully remedy any concerns about human rights we have. Obviously, that's a give and take with the Kyrgyz government. I work as a U.S. representative, trying to work with the Kyrgyz government to advance human rights, which is one of our primary foreign policy goals, and so that's a major part of it. But it is very much a give and take. There's lots of discussion over human rights issues, and sometimes those discussions are a little bit tense. But we do have those conversations, and I think they're very important. I mean, with minority communities, as I pointed out, minority rights are are always a big concern for us. And so, we meet with religious minorities, we meet with ethnic minorities, we have those conversations, and we ensure that they have a chance to talk with us as the U.S. government. So I write the Human Rights Report and the Religious Freedom Report. These are two reports on general human rights. The Religious Freedom Report used to be part of the Human Rights Report, and then they pulled it out to be specific to religious freedom. And every year, with the help of NGOs, I research what's going on, what's happened, and we put it together in a report, send it to Washington. There's a lot of editing, and eventually it becomes a public report. And if you guys want to look at the human rights reports or the religious freedom reports for Kyrgyzstan, they're available at the embassy website. And if you just click through the website, there'll be a tab called Our Relationship, and under that it'll say reports, and all of our reports for I think the last 5 years are there. So feel free to read them. I think they're pretty interesting. They are available in Russian and Kyrgyz if you'd prefer to read it in your own language, but it might be good practice to read in English. What else do we do? Well, I alluded to this, but we discuss human rights situations with the government, with other diplomats, with international organizations like the UN. Because for other diplomats, for the UN, and certainly for the government here, many of these issues are very important, and so we have conversations about them. We talk about our concerns. We talk about what's going well, and we try to have involved conversations with the government here, with other missions, diplomatic missions that are serving here, with the UN. And that's an important part of our work because we can work together to ensure that things we're concerned about are addressed. We can express our concerns to the right authorities, and that's a major part of our engagement here. I think that's the last slide, but let's see. Do I have any more? I think questions, of course. So I realize I actually am amazed that I spoke for 21 minutes because I didn't think it was going to be all that long. But I know folks may have questions. I'm happy to answer any questions, general or about the Kyrgyz Republic. Don't be shy. Please ask questions. I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, for this insightful introduction to human rights. It was very informative presentation. And from your session, we've learned about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that our human rights include the rights to life, liberty, education, and security of person. And I would like to remind our viewers, please ask your questions, and I'll be happy to read them out to our guest speaker, Colin Cram, the U.S. Embassy representative. Let me check the comment section. We have, here's the first question. Why do some groups require special human rights? Does this mean that they have more rights than others?
I think we as the U.S. government would reject that some groups require special human rights. Our argument would be all groups have the same human rights, and some groups, unfortunately, throughout history have been treated as though they have less human rights than others. I think a good example of this, and an often controversial one, we talked about minority rights. We talked about the rights of LGBTI people. We're not advocating that those people have special rights that no one else gets. We are advocating that they're able to live without threats of violence, without the inability to participate in the government, without exclusionary tactics from society, things like that. We have these same problems in our own country, right? The U.S. has a long history, and frankly, a pretty sad one, on the rights of minorities. African Americans in our country have been a major part of U.S. history, and yet they're consistently have been treated as though they have less rights. And it took societal change for us to accept and move forward on the fact that these people had their rights fundamentally violated. The African Americans in the United States do not have an extra set of rights that other people do. Quite the opposite. They have often not received the same fair share that many Americans did. And so I think the question really is, when we're talking about these groups, it's often that these people are treated as though they should not have the same rights as other people. And we find that to be a very troubling sign, but also one that is contrary to the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and our own philosophy when it comes to human rights.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. The next question is, thank you for this presentation. it's just thoughts. Maybe it's important to talk about human responsibilities along with human rights.
I mean, that's a fair point. I think the thing that we would say is that human responsibilities are generally enunciated or addressed in the laws of a country, right? So, for example, if you have laws pertaining to the way you are supposed to drive, and you break those laws, and you hit a pedestrian, or you rack up a bunch of fines because you've run 70 red lights or something along those lines, and you're arrested, we wouldn't say, well, your human rights have been violated, because there's an expectation there that you would follow the laws and be responsible for yourself within the broader societal goals. I think we can debate whether or not people use broader human rights as a way to avoid talking about their own responsibilities. But generally, I think we take the philosophy that the state has the ability. When I say the state, I mean the government has the ability to make laws, to enforce laws, and to ensure that their citizens follow the sort of norms and expectations of a country, and the law as well. Where we get concerned is, of course, when a law or a cultural tradition would be used to, violate the rights of someone. And so I think it's a really interesting point, and frankly one that's absolutely worth having conversations about. And absolutely, we would not discount human responsibilities, but we believe at the end of the day that human rights are sort of a fundamental underpinning of any society, and without those, that society is not going to function in the way that a society that respects human rights does.
Yeah, right. Thank you. The next question is, how can I defend my rights, and from whom can I claim my rights?
This is a really, I mean, this comes down to one of the biggest questions of our work, right? Well, first of all, I think one of the things that is very nice about discussing human rights in the Kyrgyz Republic is, at the end of the day, the Kyrgyz Republic has a pretty solid track record when it comes to human rights. It's not perfect, but the Kyrgyz Republic has a history of popular protest movements, of people advocating for their rights. So in terms of claiming your human rights, I think do what people here do. If you're frustrated with something, if you feel like your rights have been violated, if you feel like your rights have been taken away, I think addressing that to the government here is perfectly fine, and it's something that the Kyrgyz government has, I think, responded very well with. Just today, I mean, this is a really good example of it. In the news, I don't know if you saw, people were in front of the parliament, letting parliamentarians know how they felt about the new constitutional referendum. That's a good example of people using their rights to express their concerns about the new constitution. And so I think that's one way where you can really ask for your rights is by engaging with the government and saying, that, oh, I do not believe that this is appropriate, or I think that's a good way to do it. But also just by being involved, right? Being a good citizen, knowing what your rights are here, knowing what the laws are, knowing how those laws might affect you. and advocating for yourself. That doesn't mean you have to be part of a protest, right? That could be writing letters to members of parliament. That could be calling the mayor if something's wrong. I mean, those are all ways to express your rights and to use your rights. So the second part of the question, like who provides? Can you bring that question back up? I kind of lost the second part.
Okay, let me find it.
So like from whom do my
whom can I claim my rights?
Well, so the U.S. believes, and actually in the Kyrgyz constitution, it says as much, that the Kyrgyz people are sovereign people who have fundamental inalienable rights as enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So technically, you don't claim your rights from anyone. As a person, you have them. No one can take those away from you. The UN feels that way. The United States feels that way. Your own government feels that way. It's stated in the Constitution. I think the issue is what we have in theory, right? Our constitutions, our laws don't always match up to the reality that happens in day-to-day life. And I'll use my own country as an example. I think that the United States Constitution pretty consistently advocates for human rights and for specific human rights. But our local governments, our federal government sometimes does not do as good of a job as they should to be caretakers of said rights. And that's why you see people in the United States doing things like suing a state government because their rights have been violated. And then it'll go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would decide on said case. And if the state or the federal government have violated their rights, the U.S. Supreme Court would make a decision and ensure that from there on out that these people couldn't do the same thing. And a really good example of that is in the late 60s, United States schools were not segregated, which means that they had whites-only schools, they had black-only schools, especially in areas where there were a lot of African Americans, predominantly in the South, but in other parts of the U.S. as well. Certainly in places like Chicago and Detroit, there was segregation. The U.S. Supreme Court found that separate but equal, which is what the schools were saying, was fundamentally flawed, and you could not have an equal system that separated people by race. And so they made a decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, that you could not separate people on the basis of race simply because you could not do that and call it separate but equal. It violated the Constitution's Equal Rights Clause. And so the 14th Amendment's Equal Rights Clause. And so that became a landmark case, and schools had to integrate. This was across the board too. The University of Alabama had to admit black students, and at one point the governor attempted to have soldiers guard the University of Alabama, and the federal government had to send in, actually, I don't think they sent anyone again. The federal government, the president had to say, you cannot use the National Guard in this way, and force the governor to allow black folks to attend that school. I mean, that's a very stark example of this sort of thing. But my point here is that even the United States constantly has this give and take. And so we have our Constitution, which we rely on as a sort of foundational document about our rights, but it doesn't always work quite the way we had hoped in real life. And so then we have things like the courts, things like protests, things like talking to our lawmakers as ways to sort of tip the scale and ensure that human rights are respected for us.
Right. Thank you, Colin. We have a question here from Maksad Bek. Thank you, Maksad Bek, for your question. Are freedom from starvation and access to employment, medical services, and education adequately promoted in various human rights documents?
This is a really good question, and one that we're constantly grappling with this. Within the broader sort of human rights documents, there are sort of freedom to live, freedom to work, things like that. I think as our understanding on human rights evolves, people have started talking a lot more about economic freedoms. That's certainly something the U.S. does. But it is an interesting question because we have these sort of foundational human rights that came, out of these sort of documents I mentioned, the Magna Carta, the U.S. Constitution, other constitutions, the French Constitution, and then we use those to sort of make a universal declaration of human rights. And now, the broader thing is, it always becomes, are those sufficient? Do we need to consider more things? Economic human rights, I think the United States frequently gets a fair amount of criticism, and as a U.S. citizen, not as a diplomat, I feel like some of this criticism is pretty well founded about the inequality that has grown in our country and the fact that certain people have gotten very rich, and there's been some stagnation for the other part of the population in terms of their wealth, in terms of their income, things like that. And so in the States, we have this same conversation and debate, right? Do we have these, okay, we have these rights enshrined in the Constitution. Does it extend to this? Does it extend to something like freedom from starvation, or access to medical care? I mean, that's one where we are constantly having this debate, right? In fact, was state sued the federal government over over Obamacare last year, and it just went to the Supreme Court. The state wanted to argue that the individual mandate was unconstitutional, and so how Obamacare works is everybody has to have some form of insurance, whether it's government provided or private. And people were arguing that the individual mandate violated their human rights, and the Supreme Court decided that they weren't going to take the case because they didn't feel like it rose to the merits of that. So that's a good example of how within the United States, even, we are constantly having these debates. And many people would argue that human rights evolve as new challenges come to the forefront. And there are certainly people who would argue, who believe that human rights have gotten too expansive. I personally disagree with that, but there are people who have those arguments. But yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and I think it's a very appropriate one given how much COVID has really affected people's bottom lines, right? Like their ability to pay for basic needs, things like that. Especially now that people have been stuck inside, that they may not have been able to work. It's a very tough question that I think most countries in the world are grappling.
Thank you for your answer. Here, the next question is: are human rights only a problem in non-democratic countries?
Of course not. We have plenty of issues with democratic countries that where we question their human rights, their human rights record. I'll give you some good examples. Well, the Kyrgyz Republic is a democratic country. We do have conversations with the Kyrgyz about concerns we have, right? So that's one good example. But Pakistan, Pakistan is a democracy. We have plenty of issues with Pakistan, especially on religious freedom, but on other human rights too. We have concerns. India is one that it has certainly come up in terms of their treatment of minorities, their treatment of people in Kashmir, things like that. We have concerns. Um, I'm trying to think of other good examples. I think almost um, every democratic country we engage with, we have these sort of concerns, right? Oh, here's a really good example. France, right? France is a Western European country. In many ways, they share the same values as us in terms of the United States. So you would think that in terms of our relationship with them on human rights, we would have a pretty consistent, and we wouldn't criticize them for things. But quite the opposite. In France, we have taken issue. France banned hijabs and headscarves in schools for for religious reasons, not necessarily just for Muslims, but it disproportionately affected Muslims. And the United States made it clear that we felt like this was a violation of Islamic human rights. Like it's not okay to clearly target just one group of people because you don't want headscarves in your schools. Switzerland did a similar thing with minarets at mosques, and we had serious conversations with them about our concerns about it. Those countries, of course, just like any country, can tell us, well, we're going to do it anyway, but we will raise it as an issue. So, yeah.
Thanks. And we have more questions. And here's Sadat asking, have we made progress in combating human rights violations?
This one's tough. I think we have, but it's not perfect. You see positives. You see like warlords from Liberia being prosecuted for war crimes. You see sort of the perpetrators of war crimes in Kosovo, places like that being prosecuted. But yeah, it's not perfect. And I think, unfortunately, plenty of human rights offenders do not face maybe the sort of reckoning they should, and we sometimes fail to adequately address human rights violations. I think the United States has these issues too. I hate to go back to that, but we have a history of slavery, of issues with giving minorities rights, that I don't know that we've ever really addressed. We know it's there. I just feel like as a society, we maybe have our own kind of conversations to have about those things. But yeah, I mean, it is definitely a mixed bag. In some cases, I think we have done what we should, and we have gone after human rights offenders. In other cases, we haven't done as good of a job as we should. And that's not just the United States. That's not just Kyrgyzstan. That's, I think, every country in the world has these sort of blind spots, I guess, where we're not doing quite what we should.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Colin. Thank you, Sadat, for your question. And the next question is from Manas. Can you tell us about migrants' rights in the USA?
Sure. So generally, it's a good question. This is one that we've had plenty of debate over in the United States. There are differing thoughts on this, although I would say that generally the more legally sound one, the one that the Constitution and the Supreme Court have pretty consistently abided by, is that human rights are human rights whether or not you're a citizen or not. Non-citizens, migrants still have access to lawyers, they still have access to justice. They should have access to habeas corpus, the ability to not be arrested and held indefinitely. That, obviously, we've had a big debate over that in the United States, as I'm sure you've seen in the news, and clearly a fair amount of frustration and outrage over the government's response on that among citizens. Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. Migrants in the United States, especially, I mean, in many cases, these migrants are working, right? They're I don't want to call them economic migrants, but they are coming to the United States for jobs, especially if we're talking about migrants from Mexico or Central America. You know, they still should have job protections. I think one of the issues we have, of course, is, and this is one of the issues with one of the downsides of illegal immigration is if people aren't in the United States legally, it's tougher for us to say that someone's rights have been violated because they're operating on, you know, in sort of a non-formal economy. They're probably working for less than they should be for companies that are unfortunately employing them because they're cheaper. And that's an issue. Like, I don't think anyone would argue it's not an issue. In fact, quite the opposite. I think most people agree that's an issue. And for some of the people who are opponents of the level of illegal immigration there is to the States right now, they point to that and say, well, there's not really any way for us, you know, it's created this other economy and, you know, we can't protect people. So, you know, I think that this is yet another way in which the United States is going to have these conversations. They're often difficult. You know, the U.S. has a history as a country almost exclusively of migrants. If you know, especially if we're not talking about Native Americans, you know, no one came from America, you know, 10 generations back. They were from somewhere else, and so you know, that's the case for my family, for others. And we have had throughout our history debates on immigration, and there have been times when we have been fairly open in our immigration policy, and other times when we have been fairly closed in our immigration policy. And so I do think that that's you know, a fair question, and I think it's one that we ourselves are debating. You know, it's also just it's a question that I think for many of us is a very important one that sort of goes to the heart of who we are as a country, right? You know, that is one of the great things about the United States, though, is that at the end of the day, we're able to sort of debate these things and debate them pretty vociferously, right? We can, you know, we can tell our politicians how we feel about these things. So yeah, you know, but definitely, that's an excellent example of one of the ways in which the U.S. itself still has these sort of debates.
Thank you. We have more questions from Maksat. Here is the next question. Are there conflicts between the rights of women and the rights of the child? For example, does childcare such as breastfeeding interfere with the right of the woman to follow her own interests?
I mean,
Question.
I don't think. Well, no, it's okay. I mean, I don't think we would argue that the rights of anyone would extend so far as to not be responsible for the care of their children. We tend to take. I mean, we have an expansive view of human rights, but we also clearly believe that human rights only go so far before they've sort of crossed over into either harming someone else or that being said, I mean, if a woman were to have a child and decided that she couldn't take care of it and needed to put it up for adoption because, as you said, she had to take care of other things, whether that was work or something similar, of course that's her right to do so, and the child should be taken care of by by whomever is taking on that child's care. We would also argue the child still has rights, even if it is adopted, even if it's given to a state institution. We still expect that child will be cared for and be able to have human rights. I think it's an interesting question though, because it is one of those things where at the end of the day, there's always these sort of balances for human rights, right? That's one of the things that I think will always provide some level of debate, right?
Thanks. The next question is, thanks for this presentation. How can human rights influence the national budgets? And is there any hierarchy among human rights?
In terms of budgetary conditions, I mean, that's a good question. As I said in the beginning of our talk, the U.S. fundamentally believes that states that are more democratic, that have more human rights, tend to be more prosperous. I know there has been plenty of debate, and I think it is ongoing, as to whether more prosperous states are more democratic because they started as more prosperous states, or if indeed the fact that whether or not more democratic states tend to stay more prosperous. It's a fair debate, but I would argue, I spent a lot of time in Africa before I was in other parts of the world. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Togo. Togo had not a great record of human rights or democracy. Right next door was Ghana, much more free, democratically elected state. The level of economy between those two was significantly different. Now, there were other things at play, and I won't simplify it just to say, well, one was a democracy and one wasn't. Ghana's larger, so that to some degree helps with the economy. They had some natural resources, but they managed it well, and I think people were more willing to work with them because they had a reputation as a government that supported human rights, that was democratic, and so more people came to work there too. And now Ghana's actually doing. I mean, they're not like a rich country, but they're doing pretty well. And I think part of it is that in the 1970s they became a democratic country and they stuck with it, even though it was hard. And they eventually kind of created this upward effect where, by being a democratic country, they attracted more investment, they were more stable, and it sort of paid off. In terms of hierarchy of human rights, it's a good question. I would say yes, but only at a very fundamental level. I think we would argue that there are certain human rights that underpin all other human rights. So that is sort of the right, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of belief. All of those, we would argue, are sort of underpinning all the other ones. Because you can say something like, well, from freedom of expression, a gay person should be able to express, well, I'm a gay person, and not live with fear of reprisal because they're homosexual, right? For freedom of speech, you could say, well, okay, if this person has a freedom of speech, they don't have to be scared of criticizing their government and asking for accountability. So I think we would argue that there may be some hierarchy there, but we would never argue, well, one right trumps the other. If we would never say one right is more important than the other, so you can ignore this one and only focus on this one. We tend to not look at it in that light. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights certainly doesn't sort of have this hierarchical stance on human rights. It tends to believe that these are fundamental human rights, and they're important for everyone. And I think generally we follow that line, right? That the Universal Declaration has human rights. You may be able to build on some of those human rights, but most people's rights come from those specific rights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we will take the last question from the audience. Here is the question from Assad. How can we conflict between the internationally recognized human rights and national laws that violate these rights be negotiated?
That is a great question. And it's great because I think this is one of the easier questions that I've had. We would argue, if there is a law that violates human rights, that we shouldn't negotiate. It simply is a law that is not fit to be a law, because it violates human rights. For us, for the U.S. government, and I think for many governments, and certainly from a standpoint of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, those are foundational. And so if you write a law against them, you're violating human rights, and therefore that's not a law that should be used. That's a law contrary to international expectations, to the norms that we expect. That's a law that will probably have negative repercussions in the future. Because people are going to not be able to fully engage in their rights, but also B, because it probably will attract attention for your country in the wrong way, right? In Kazakhstan, they actually just got rid of it. They had a law that essentially made it impossible to have labor unions, and they got negative attention every year from the International Labor Organization, from the UN, from the US, from the EU about this law, because everybody was like, well, this violates the freedom of assembly. Excuse me, not assembly, the freedom of association. This violates freedom of association. And I think just this last year, they decided that they were going to drop the law off their books because they were tired of constantly, having to deal with people saying, well, we're not going to do this with you because you have a law in the books that violates freedom of assembly. Let's see, what's another good example? This is just this last week, the U.S. talked about the watch list for international freedom. And actually, the Kyrgyz Republic, for a long time, has been the only country that is not either on the watch list or a country of special concern for religious freedom. So this is really positive for the Kyrgyz Republic. Like, this is something that Kyrgyz Republic should be very positive, very proud of. The Kyrgyz Republic is the only country in Central Asia that hasn't either been on the watch list or is a country of special concern. Uzbekistan actually just got off this week of the watch list because they had taken concrete steps to make sure that minorities could worship in their country. And so that's another good example of of this sort of dynamic. And so but generally, when there are violations because of a law, we will say something. I mean, with Uzbekistan, we were constantly complaining to Uzbekistan about how bad this law made them look and how we were going to leave them on the watch list unless they changed this law, and they changed it. So,
Thank you, Colin. I see some questions from viewers repeated. You almost covered all of these questions. We're talking about human rights almost for an hour. I think all our viewers can come back. This video will be at Bishkek American Spaces Facebook page. You can come back and watch it again. Thank you, Colin, for this insightful introduction to human rights. It was very interesting. It was very useful. And we learned that we should know our rights. We should advocate for them and be responsible citizens. Thank you so much for this session. I want to thank our viewers as well, that you were very active. You were asking questions. And thanks, Colin, for your time and for answering to all of these questions.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for participating. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
You too. You guys have a nice night. It was wonderful talking to you.
Bye.